Before we begin, understand this is not about getting high. This is not a story about euphoria or escape or the thrill of crossing a line society has drawn in the sand. This is a story about control, about who gets to decide what enhancement means and what addiction looks like, about how a synthetic molecule, originally designed to help desperate lungs pull in air, became the fuel that powered the bloodiest war in human history, then transformed into a weapon wielded against the very people it was meant to serve. This is the story of amphetamine, and it is, in many ways, the story of the entire 20th century. Before we go further, I need to ask something of you. If this story resonates, if you find value in what we're uncovering here, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. These small gestures help this work reach others who are searching for the same buried truths. It matters more than you might think. Now, phone away, distractions silenced, settle in. What you're about to hear is not sensationalism. It's not designed to shock or horrify, though at times it will do both. This is history, meticulously researched, carefully assembled, and told with the weight it deserves. The story of amphetamine is a mirror held up to our civilization's deepest contradictions. It reveals how medicine and warfare became inseparable, how productivity became a virtue more sacred than health, how capitalism learned to monetize human exhaustion, how governments learned that the same substance could be prescribed to children in one form and used to justify imprisonment in another. Amphetamine promised enhancement. It delivered destruction. But the destruction was never random. It was calculated, targeted, and shaped by forces far more powerful than the drug itself. This journey will take us from ancient Chinese medicine to Nazi blitzkrieg, from suburban housewives to rural meth labs, from the battlefields of World War II to the college campuses of today. We will trace how one molecule became two stories, two Americas, two systems of justice that exist side by side, never acknowledging the cognitive dissonance at their core. So let's begin. In the beginning, there was no pill, only a plant and desperate lungs gasping for air. Long before amphetamine existed as a concept, before laboratories and chemical formulas and pharmaceutical patents, there was Ephedra sinica, a humble, unassuming shrub with thin green stems and scale-like leaves, growing wild across the arid plains and mountain slopes of northern China and Mongolia. The ancient Chinese called it ma huang, which translates roughly as hemp yellow, though it bears no relation to cannabis. The name referred to the color of its dried stems, which turned a distinctive yellowish-brown after harvest. For at least 5,000 years, ma huang held a place of honor in traditional Chinese medicine. It appears in the Shennong Ben Cao Jing, the Divine Farmer's Materia Medica, one of the oldest surviving pharmacological texts in human history, compiled around 200 BCE, but drawing on oral traditions that stretch back millennia. The ancient physicians understood what modern science would later confirm. This plant contains something powerful, something that opened constricted airways and allowed breath to flow freely again. This was not recreational. This was survival. Asthma, bronchitis, respiratory infections, conditions that could kill in an era without antibiotics or emergency medicine. When a child's lungs seized in the night, when an elder's breathing became shallow and labored, ma huang was the remedy. Healers would harvest the stems, dry them carefully, then boil them in water to create a bitter medicinal tea. The patient would drink, and within minutes, the airways would relax, breath would return. Life would continue. The active compound responsible for this near-miraculous effect was ephedrine, a naturally occurring alkaloid that stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. Ephedrine and amphetamine are chemical cousins, nearly identical in structure, differing by only a single hydroxyl group. Both work by triggering the release of norepinephrine and dopamine in the brain, increasing heart rate, dilating bronchial passages, and sharpening mental focus. But in ma huang, ephedrine existed in its natural context, surrounded by dozens of other plant compounds that modulated its effects, softened its edges, made it gently on the body. This was botanical wisdom, humans learning from plants, a partnership refined over centuries of careful observation. As trade routes expanded across Asia, ma huang traveled with the caravans. The Silk Road carried it westward into India, Persia, and eventually the Middle East.
Tibetan monks used it to stay alert during long meditation sessions in the thin air of high-altitude monasteries. Mongolian herders brewed
combat altitude sickness and the brutal cold of the steppes. Indian Ayurvedic practitioners incorporated it into their own formulations, recognizing its warming, stimulating properties. Each culture adopted ma huang to its own healing traditions, but the core understanding remained consistent. This was medicine for the breath, for the vital force that sustains life. It was respected, carefully dosed, integrated into systems of knowledge that viewed the human body as inseparable from the natural world. Then came the West. By the late 19th century, European and American scientists had become obsessed with a particular kind of pharmaceutical reductionism. They believed that every plant's healing power could be traced to a single active ingredient, and that if you could isolate that ingredient, purify it, synthesize it, you could create something superior to nature, something standardized, patentable, profitable. Ma huang fascinated Western chemists precisely because its effects were so dramatic and so reliable. If they could determine what made it work, if they could strip away the unnecessary plant material and concentrate the essence, they could control it, manufacture it, own it. This impulse would change everything. By the 1880s, Western chemists were obsessed with one question: what made ma huang work? In 1887, a Romanian chemist named Lazar Edeleanu, working in the laboratories of the University of Berlin, found the answer. Or rather, he created something entirely new while searching for it. Edeleanu was attempting to synthesize ephedrine, the active alkaloid in ma huang, but his experiments took an unexpected turn. Through a process involving the reduction of phenylacetone with ammonia and hydrogen, he produced a novel compound, phenyl isopropylamine, a molecule that had never existed before in the history of the universe until that moment in Berlin. He had synthesized amphetamine. But here is the profound irony at the heart of the story. Edeleanu had no idea what he had made. He documented the synthesis in his doctoral thesis, recorded its chemical structure with meticulous precision, filed the work in the academic archives, and moved on. No medical applications were proposed, no pharmaceutical interest was expressed. No one recognized that this colorless, oily liquid contained within its molecular structure the power to reshape human consciousness, fuel armies, and eventually ignite a global crisis. Amphetamine, the most powerful synthetic stimulant the world would ever know, sat dormant in laboratory records for 40 years. The lost decades, 1887 to 1927. 4 decades during which this molecule existed only as a footnote in obscure chemistry journals, a curiosity of organic synthesis with no apparent purpose. Ephedra continued to be harvested and boiled into tea. Cocaine was the stimulant of choice in Western medicine, widely prescribed and legally sold. The world turned, wars were fought, empires rose and fell, and amphetamine waited, unknown and untested, for someone to recognize what it could do. That someone was Gordon Alice. An American chemist working at the University of California, Los Angeles, Alice was searching for a synthetic substitute for ephedrine in 1927. Natural ephedra supplies were unreliable, subject to crop failures and geopolitical disruptions. The pharmaceutical industry wanted something they could manufacture in a laboratory, something consistent and controllable. Alice, unaware of Edeleanu's work 4 decades earlier, set out to create it. He synthesized phenyl isopropylamine using a slightly different method, and then, in the tradition of pioneering chemists throughout history, he did what scientists of that era often did when confronted with a new compound. He tested it on himself. On a spring evening in 1927, Gordon Alice dissolved a small amount of the substance in water and swallowed it. Then he waited. Within 20 minutes, the effects began. A sense of well-being flooded through him, profound and unmistakable. His thinking became crystalline, sharply focused, as if a fog he hadn't known was there had suddenly lifted. Confidence surged, fatigue vanished. His heart rate increased, his pupils dilated, and a restless energy coursed through his body that lasted for hours. He felt, in his own words, a sense of clear thinking and confidence unlike anything he had experienced before. Alice understood immediately what he had discovered. This was not just a replacement for ephedrine. This was something far more potent, far more transformative. This was a drug that could keep soldiers awake, workers productive, students alert, a drug that could make people feel invincible, at least for a while.
He filed for a patent in 1932. Shortly after, Smith, Kline & Franks, a small but ambitious pharmaceutical company based in Philadelphia, recognized the commercial potential and purchased the rights. They saw what Edelianu, 45 years earlier, had not. They saw what Alice
himself perhaps did not fully grasp. They saw profit, and they saw power. Within months, they would bring amphetamine to market in a form that would make it accessible to millions. The age of synthetic stimulants was about to begin, and no one, not the chemists, not the pharmaceutical executives, not the doctors who would soon prescribe it freely, understood the magnitude of what they were unleashing. In 1932, a small Philadelphia pharmaceutical company saw what Edelianu had missed: profit and power. Smith, Kline & French moved quickly. By late 1932, they had developed a delivery system for amphetamine that was ingenious in its simplicity and devastating in its unintended consequences. They called it the Benzedrine inhaler, a small tubular device made of lightweight plastic designed to fit comfortably in a pocket or purse. Inside was a cotton strip saturated with 250 milligrams of amphetamine base, along with menthol and lavender oil to mask the chemical harshness and provide a cooling sensation. The marketing was impeccably innocent. This was medicine for the common cold, for hay fever, for asthma and nasal congestion. Sufferers were instructed to crack open the plastic tube, hold the cotton strip beneath their nostrils, and inhale deeply. The vapors would open the airways, clear the sinuses, restore easy breathing. Doctor approved, over the counter, no prescription necessary. It seemed harmless enough, a modern solution to age-old respiratory complaints, packaged with the authority of pharmaceutical science and the convenience of mass production. But people are curious, and people talk. Somewhere, perhaps in a truck stop diner along Route 66, perhaps in a factory break room, perhaps in a college dormitory late at night, someone discovered that if you broke open the Benzedrine inhaler and removed the cotton strip, if you tore it into pieces and swallowed it, or dissolved it in hot coffee and drank the bitter liquid, something extraordinary happened. The fatigue that had been weighing you down vanished. Your mind sharpened. Confidence flooded in. Hours of work that had seemed impossible suddenly felt manageable, even easy. You could stay awake all night if you needed to. You could push through exhaustion, through boredom, through the grinding monotony of physical labor or long-distance driving. The knowledge spread rapidly through the underground networks of American working life. Truck drivers began carrying Benzedrine inhalers as standard equipment, calling them co-pilots for the way they kept you alert on endless stretches of highway through the night. Factory workers on brutal 12-hour shifts discovered that a cotton strip soaked in amphetamine could make the hours pass faster, the repetitive motions less soul-crushing. Students facing examinations found that Benzedrine transformed cramming sessions, allowing them to absorb information with laser focus and study until dawn without collapsing. This was America's first widespread encounter with amphetamine, and it was almost entirely accidental. Smith, Kline & French had not intended to create a stimulant for mass consumption. They had intended to sell a decongestant. But the line between medicine and enhancement, between treatment and augmentation, was thinner than anyone realized. Once people discovered what amphetamine could do, not just to their breathing but to their minds, their productivity, their sense of possibility, there was no going back. The company watched sales climb. They watched the Benzedrine inhaler become a fixture in American life, and in 1937, they made a decision that would transform amphetamine from an underground secret into a mainstream phenomenon. They released Benzedrine in tablet form. Now you didn't have to crack open an inhaler and chew on a foul-tasting cotton strip. You could simply swallow a small pharmaceutical-grade pill, 5 milligrams or 10 milligrams of amphetamine sulfate, precisely dosed, elegantly packaged. These tablets required a prescription, but prescriptions were astonishingly easy to obtain. Doctors, many of them influenced by pharmaceutical marketing that emphasized amphetamine's safety and versatility, prescribed Benzedrine tablets freely for an ever-expanding list of conditions: mild depression, chronic fatigue, narcolepsy, obesity, low energy, psychoneurotic states. The American Medical Association endorsed amphetamine as a legitimate treatment for these and more, lending the full weight of medical authority to its use. By 1939, hundreds of thousands of Americans were taking Benzedrine tablets daily, prescribed by their physicians and purchased at their local pharmacies. But millions more were still using the inhalers, still cracking them open, still discovering through trial and error that 250 milligrams of amphetamine delivered all at once produced effects far more intense than any tablet. The divide between legal medical use and semi-legal recreational use blurred until it was nearly
meaningless. No one was tracking the long-term effects. No one was asking what happened when you took amphetamine, not occasionally for acute symptoms, but regularly, day after day, week after week. No one was considering the possibility that a drug this powerful, this effective at making people feel invincible, might come with costs that wouldn't reveal themselves for years. Amphetamine had escaped containment. It was in medicine cabinets and glove compartments, in dorm rooms and factory lockers. It was prescribed by doctors and improvised by users. It was everywhere. And then everything accelerated. By 1939, Benzedrine was everywhere, and then the world went to war. In Germany, a pharmaceutical company called Temmler had been watching the success of American amphetamine with keen interest. In 1938, they released their own stimulant to the German market. They called it Pervitin. It was methamphetamine, a close chemical relative of amphetamine, but significantly more potent. Where amphetamine stimulates, methamphetamine devastates inhibition, obliterates fatigue, and floods the brain with dopamine at levels that feel to the user like invincibility itself. Temmler marketed Pervitin as Germany's miracle pill. It was sold over the counter, no prescription required, packaged in cheerful tins, and promoted for everything from depression to low energy to the demands of modern life. Housewives took it to manage their households with tireless efficiency. Students took it to study through the night. Workers took it to endure long shifts in factories preparing for a war everyone knew was coming. But the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, saw something else in Pervitin. They saw the future of warfare. Military physicians began conducting trials in 1939, testing methamphetamine on soldiers under controlled conditions. The results were extraordinary and deeply unsettling. Soldiers given Pervitin could stay awake for 36 hours or more without meaningful degradation in performance. They reported feeling alert, focused, fearless. Physical pain became distant, abstract. Hunger disappeared. Doubt evaporated. They would march until their feet bled and barely notice. They would follow orders without hesitation, without the moral friction that sometimes causes men to pause before violence. The German High Command recognized the strategic implications immediately. Modern warfare, particularly the Blitzkrieg doctrine Germany was preparing to unleash, demanded speed and relentlessness. Armies that could move faster, fight longer, and strike without rest would overwhelm any opponent still constrained by human limitations like sleep and exhaustion. In the spring of 1940, as German forces massed along the borders of France and the Low Countries, Pervitin became standard issue. Soldiers received tablets before combat operations with explicit orders to take them. Panzer tank crews were given especially large supplies. These men would be driving armored columns deep into enemy territory, sometimes for days without stopping, and they needed to stay sharp behind the controls of machines that required constant, precise attention. On May 10, 1940, the invasion began. What followed was unlike any military campaign in history. German forces moved with a speed and ferocity that defied comprehension. Panzer divisions advanced nonstop for 36, 48, even 72 hours, crushing through defenses that had been designed to withstand weeks of siege. Soldiers marched through day and night without pause. The Luftwaffe flew sortie after sortie, pilots climbing back into cockpits after missions that should have left them too exhausted to function. France, which had expected a grinding war of attrition like the First World War, collapsed in 6 weeks. Historians would later analyze the Blitzkrieg through the lens of tactics and technology, the innovative use of combined arms, the concentration of armor, the integration of air support. All of this was true, but beneath the strategy, fueling the relentless momentum, was methamphetamine. German soldiers were not superhuman. They were chemically enhanced, running on a drug that made them feel superhuman, while their bodies accumulated damage they could not yet perceive. The Luftwaffe was particularly dependent on Pervitin. Pilots flying high-altitude missions faced extreme cold and oxygen deprivation, conditions that induced fatigue and cognitive impairment. Methamphetamine countered these effects, keeping pilots alert and aggressive even as their bodies screamed for rest. Some pilots flew multiple combat missions in a single day, sustained entirely by Pervitin and adrenaline. By 1941, Pervitin had become so integral to German military operations that the Wehrmacht was distributing it on a staggering scale. Millions of tablets were shipped to the front lines every month. Soldiers began to depend on it not just for combat, but for daily functioning. The drug that had promised to
them invincible was beginning to reveal its costs. Men who had been taking Pervitin for months started exhibiting disturbing symptoms. Paranoia crept in, a creeping suspicion of comrades and commanders. Some experienced full psychotic breaks, hearing voices, seeing enemies that did not exist.
Others simply collapsed after multi-day binges, their bodies finally asserting the biological debt that methamphetamine had merely deferred. There were reports of soldiers dying suddenly from heart failure, their cardiovascular systems unable to sustain the relentless stimulation. The Wehrmacht's medical corps began to express concern, but by then it was too late. Pervitin was woven into the fabric of German military strategy. To withdraw it would mean admitting that the Blitzkrieg's success had been built at least in part on chemical augmentation. And there was another problem. The man at the very top of the Third Reich was himself addicted. Adolf Hitler had suffered from various ailments throughout his life: chronic stomach pain, insomnia, tremors. In 1936, he came under the care of Dr. Theodor Morell, a physician whose approach to medicine was unconventional, to say the least. Morell began administering daily injections to Hitler, a cocktail he called Vitamolten. It contained vitamins, hormones, and methamphetamine. By 1941, Hitler was receiving these injections multiple times per day. The effects were visible to those close to him. He became increasingly erotic, prone to fits of rage followed by periods of grandiose confidence. His decision-making grew more impulsive, more detached from reality. Some historians have argued that the disastrous strategic choices Hitler made in the later years of the war, invading the Soviet Union, declaring war on the United States, refusing to allow tactical retreats, were influenced at least in part by methamphetamine-induced delusions of invincibility. By 1942, the Wehrmacht had distributed approximately 35 million Pervitin tablets in a single year. 35 million doses of methamphetamine issued to soldiers who were often teenagers, who had no understanding of what they were taking or what it would do to them over time. An entire generation of young German men became dependent on a drug that their own government was forcing upon them in the name of military efficiency. The Blitzkrieg had worked, at least initially, but the chemical foundation upon which it was built was crumbling. Soldiers were burning out, collapsing, becoming liabilities rather than assets. The euphoria of invincibility was giving way to the long, grinding reality of addiction and withdrawal, and the war, which Germany had hoped to win quickly through speed and aggression, was becoming a protracted nightmare that no amount of methamphetamine could sustain. The Third Reich had unleashed a weapon that was as destructive to its own forces as it was to the enemy, and other nations were watching, learning, preparing to deploy their own chemical arsenals. The Allies watched Germany's chemical advantage with alarm and decided to match it. Britain moved first. By 1939, as the Royal Air Force prepared for what would become the Battle of Britain, military physicians began issuing benzidine tablets to pilots and aircrews. The logic was straightforward and grimly practical. German bombers were pounding British cities night after night. RAF pilots were flying multiple sorties per day, sometimes with only a few hours of rest between missions. Exhaustion was not just degrading performance, it was killing men who fell asleep at the controls or made fatal errors in judgment because their minds were too tired to process information quickly enough. Amphetamine became the solution. Between 1939 and 1945, the British military issued approximately 72 million benzidine tablets to the Royal Air Force, Army, and Navy. 72 million doses of pharmaceutical speed, distributed with medical authority and patriotic necessity. RAF bomber crews received special attention. These men flew 12-hour missions deep into German territory, navigating through darkness and anti-aircraft fire, their aircraft loaded with tons of explosives, every moment demanding perfect focus. Before takeoff, medical officers would hand out benzidine tablets with the same casual efficiency as distributing parachutes. It was not optional, it was standard operating procedure. Take the pill, stay sharp, come home alive. The American military, watching both the German and British programs, launched its own amphetamine distribution system on an even larger scale. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States military issued approximately 180 million amphetamine tablets to its forces. 180 million. The numbers are staggering, almost incomprehensible. That is roughly one tablet for every man, woman, and child in America at the time, except these pills went exclusively to young men in combat zones. The Pacific
Theater became a proving ground for amphetamine's utility under the most brutal conditions imaginable. Island-hopping campaigns, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, subjected American forces to heat, humidity, dense jungle, malaria, dysentery, and an enemy that fought with suicidal determination. Soldiers were often awake for days at a time, dug into foxholes, waiting for attacks that could come at any moment. Exhaustion was not just uncomfortable, it was lethal. Amphetamine kept them functional, medical officers distributed tablets before assaults during prolonged defensive positions whenever the command structure determined that alertness was more important than rest. And in the Pacific, that was almost always. The drug became as essential as ammunition, as routine as rations. Soldiers took it without question, without stigma, because it came from doctors, because officers endorsed it, because it worked. On Guadalcanal in 1942, Marines fought for 6 months in conditions that broke men physically and psychologically. Many survived on amphetamine, taking tablets to stay awake through nights when Japanese forces would launch sudden, screaming assaults out of the jungle darkness. On Iwo Jima in 1945, the battle lasted 36 days of relentless, close-quarters combat. Soldiers dosed on amphetamine fought until their bodies simply gave out, and then they took more pills and fought again. The Japanese military had its own chemical program. They called their methamphetamine Hiropon, and like the Germans, they issued it widely to soldiers, pilots, and kamikaze units. The kamikaze pilots were of particular note, young men, often teenagers, selected for suicide missions and given methamphetamine before climbing into aircraft loaded with explosives. The drug did not make them braver, it made them feel braver, numbed their terror, allowed them to fly toward American ships with a chemically induced sense of purpose that might otherwise have faltered. This was chemical warfare, but not in the traditional sense. No one was gassing the enemy. Instead, every major combatant nation was dosing its own troops, conducting a massive, uncontrolled experiment in pharmacological enhancement, with millions of young men as unwitting test subjects. And it was not just the stimulants. The medical officers quickly discovered a problem. Soldiers who had been taking amphetamine for days or weeks could not sleep when they finally had the opportunity. Their nervous systems were too jangled, their minds too wired, their bodies vibrating with residual chemical energy. The solution was barbiturates, sedatives like sodium amytal and phenobarbital, handed out after missions to force sleep. Up in the morning on amphetamine, down at night on barbiturates, a chemical yo-yo, oscillating between artificial wakefulness and induced unconsciousness, day after day, month after month. The human body was not designed for this. The brain was not designed for this. But the war did not care about design parameters. It cared about whether soldiers could fight, and amphetamine made them fight longer and harder than biology alone would allow. The normalization was complete. Amphetamine was not seen as a drug in the recreational or illicit sense. It was medicine, issued by doctors, sanctioned by military command, essential to victory. There was no moral ambiguity, no cultural stigma. It was simply another tool in the arsenal, like a rifle or a radio. But tools have consequences. Soldiers who took amphetamine for months or years began to exhibit the same symptoms the Germans had reported: paranoia, aggression, psychosis, cardiovascular damage. Some died suddenly of heart attacks at 22 years old. Others returned home with neurological damage that would haunt them for decades. Many developed a psychological dependency, a learned association between the drug and the feeling of being capable, alert, powerful. When the war ended in 1945, the largest controlled drug experiment in history abruptly stopped. Millions of men who had been taking amphetamine regularly, often daily, were suddenly cut off. They returned home to civilian life, to jobs and families in a society that had no understanding of what they had experienced or what chemicals had sustained them through it. Some adjusted, many did not. They remembered what amphetamine felt like. They remembered the clarity, the energy, the sense that anything was possible. And they knew that the same drug, or something very similar, was available back home, in inhalers, in tablets, prescribed by doctors who didn't ask too many questions. The war had ended, but the pills once unleashed did not simply disappear. They migrated from the battlefield to the factory, from the bomber cockpit to the truck cab, from the military physician to the family doctor. Amphetamine had proven itself in the most extreme conditions humanity could create. Now it was about to prove itself in the ordinary, grinding exhausting
of peacetime life. When the war ended in 1945, the pills didn't stop. Millions of soldiers came home with a habit. Veterans who had relied on amphetamine to survive combat found civilian life strangely exhausting by comparison. The clarity, the energy, the sense of capability they had felt on benzedrine or dexedrine, it was gone. They went to doctors complaining of fatigue, depression, difficulty concentrating. And doctors, many of them former military physicians who had distributed amphetamine freely during the war, wrote prescriptions without hesitation. The drug that had won the war could surely help men adjust to peace. The pharmaceutical industry, watching this unfold, recognized an opportunity of staggering proportions.
If amphetamine could be marketed not just to veterans but to the entire population for everyday complaints that every person experiences, tiredness, sadness, lack of motivation, the market would be effectively limitless. And so the marketing blitz began. By the early 1950s, amphetamine was being promoted as a treatment for an ever-expanding list of conditions. The Food and Drug Administration approved it for 31 separate medical indications. 31. Depression, fatigue, narcolepsy, obesity, alcoholism, psychoneurotic states, minimal brain dysfunction in children, even seasickness. If you were tired, there was amphetamine. If you were sad, there was amphetamine. If you were overweight, there was amphetamine. Weight loss became the primary marketing focus. Smith, Kline, and French introduced Dexamyl in 1950, a combination of dextroamphetamine and amobarbiturate, a barbiturate. The amphetamine suppressed appetite and provided energy. The barbiturate smoothed out the jittery side effects and helped users sleep at night. It was marketed as the perfect diet pill, and it became a blockbuster. Millions of American women, told by their doctors and their culture that they needed to lose weight, took Dexamyl daily. They lost weight, certainly. They also became dependent on a drug that was chemically rewiring their brains. Suburban housewives became a particular target. Advertisements in medical journals depicted exhausted mothers surrounded by children, laundry, dishes, endless domestic obligations. The solution, the ad suggested, was amphetamine. Give her dexedrine for energy. Give her benzedrine for motivation. She will manage her household with tireless efficiency. She will smile through the exhaustion. This was years before Valium would be marketed as Mother's Little Helper. Amphetamine held that role first. Truck drivers who had discovered amphetamine during the war continued using it in peacetime. Students preparing for exams relied on it. Factory workers on night shifts depended on it. The drug moved seamlessly from battlefield to highway, from bomber cockpit to college library, from military necessity to civilian convenience. Children were not spared. In the 1950s, doctors began diagnosing increasing numbers of children with what they called minimal brain dysfunction, a vague constellation of symptoms that included restlessness, difficulty focusing, and disruptive behavior. The treatment was amphetamine, often in the form of dexedrine or benzedrine, prescribed to children as young as 5 or 6. This was the precursor to modern ADHD treatment, but without the decades of research and diagnostic refinement that would come later. Many of these children were simply energetic or bored or responding normally to dysfunctional environments. They were medicated anyway. By 1958, American pharmaceutical companies were producing 3.5 billion amphetamine tablets annually. 3.5 billion. That is enough for every adult in the United States to take a pill every other day, all year long, and many people were doing exactly that. The prescription model created a veneer of medical legitimacy that obscured what was actually happening. This was mass amphetamine use on a scale that dwarfed anything the military had done, but because it came from doctors, because it was framed as treatment rather than enhancement or recreation, society did not see it as a drug problem. Prescription meant safety, medical supervision meant control. These assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong. Across the Pacific, Japan was experiencing a different kind of post-war amphetamine crisis, one that revealed the drug's true potential for social destruction. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the military had vast stockpiles of Hiropon, the methamphetamine that had been issued to soldiers and kamikaze pilots. Rather than destroy these stockpiles, they were released onto the civilian market and sold over-the-counter in pharmacies as a remedy for fatigue and depression. The result was an epidemic of unprecedented scale. By 1954, an estimated 2 million Japanese civilians, roughly 2% of the entire population, were addicted to methamphetamine. The social fabric began to tear. Crime rates
surged. Psychosis became common. Families disintegrated. The Japanese government, forced to confront the catastrophe they had inadvertently created, enacted emergency legislation banning methamphetamine and imposing severe penalties for its manufacture and distribution. Japan's crisis was a warning, a glimpse into what happens when potent stimulants flood a civilian population without adequate controls. But America was not paying attention. American doctors and pharmaceutical executives looked at Japan's methamphetamine epidemic and saw it as a foreign problem, a consequence of wartime chaos and cultural differences. They did not see the parallels to their own pharmaceutical amphetamine boom. They did not recognize that the same drug, distributed under medical supervision rather than sold in pharmacies, could produce similar devastation if the scale and duration of use continued to expand unchecked. The golden age of medical amphetamine continued. Prescriptions flowed, profits soared, and beneath the surface the costs were accumulating, invisible for now, but inexorable. But by the late 1950s, the cracks were showing.
Speed had a dark side. In the early 1960s, something unexpected happened in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. Young people, drawn by the promise of communal living and psychedelic exploration, began experimenting with the same amphetamine pills their parents were taking legally, but in ways the pharmaceutical companies had never intended. They crushed benzodrine and dexedrine tablets into powder, dissolved them in water, and injected the solution directly into their veins. The effect was nothing like swallowing a pill. Intravenous amphetamine hit the brain in seconds, producing a rush of euphoria so intense it felt like the entire universe had suddenly snapped into perfect focus. Everything seemed possible, everything seemed connected, everything seemed urgent and profound. It was, for a brief moment, overwhelming bliss. But that moment didn't last. The people who injected amphetamine regularly, who chased that initial rush again and again, became known as speed freaks. The term was not affectionate. It was descriptive, clinical, horrifying. Speed freaks were visible, impossible to ignore. They moved with jittery, compulsive energy, their bodies thin to the point of emaciation, their skin covered in sores from obsessive picking. Their eyes were wild, pupils dilated, darting constantly as if tracking invisible threats. Many stopped eating, stopped sleeping for days at a time, trapped in cycles of injection and paranoia that spiraled deeper with each dose. Methadone, an intravenous pharmaceutical methamphetamine manufactured by Burroughs Wellcome, became the drug of choice. It was legally produced, prescribed by doctors for narcolepsy and obesity, but easily diverted onto the black market. Vials of pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamines circulated through Haight-Ashbury like currency, and the community's experiment with consciousness expansion began to curdle into something far darker. Psychosis became common. People who had been injecting methamphetamine for weeks or months lost their grip on consensus reality. They heard voices that did not exist. They saw conspiracies everywhere. Some became convinced that insects were crawling beneath their skin and would tear at their flesh for hours, creating open wounds that refused to heal because they kept picking, kept digging, kept searching for creatures that were never there. Violence erupted. Methamphetamine strips away inhibition and floods the brain with paranoia, a combination that turns minor conflicts into physical confrontations. The Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, which had opened in 1967 to serve the neighborhood's young population, began treating injuries from fights, stabbings, beatings, all fueled by methamphetamine-induced rage and fear. By 1967, the counterculture itself recognized that something had gone terribly wrong. Posters appeared on telephone poles and storefronts throughout Haight-Ashbury, stark black letters on white backgrounds, "Speed kills." This was not a government warning or a medical establishment admonition. This was the community warning itself, acknowledging that methamphetamine was destroying people they knew, people they loved, and that it had to stop. Ken Kesey, whose merry pranksters had pioneered psychedelic exploration in the early 1960s, publicly rejected amphetamine. The Grateful Dead, whose concerts had become central to the Haight-Ashbury scene, spoke openly about the destructive nature of speed. It was antithetical, they argued, to the psychedelic ethos of peace, exploration, and spiritual growth. LSD and psychedelic might expand consciousness, but methamphetamine destroyed it, reducing users to paranoid, aggressive shadows of themselves. The cultural split was now complete and deeply hypocritical. Street methamphetamine, injected by young people in the Haight, was demonized as evil, destructive.
A plague on the counterculture. But prescription amphetamine, swallowed in pill form by suburban housewives, truck drivers, students, and children diagnosed with minimal brain dysfunction, remained perfectly acceptable. The medical establishment continued to prescribe it freely. Pharmaceutical companies continued to manufacture it in staggering quantities, and society at large saw no contradiction. In 1970, American pharmaceutical companies produced 12 billion doses of amphetamine. 12 billion. That is approximately 50 pills for every man, woman, and child in the United States. The vast majority of this production was entirely legal, distributed through pharmacies, prescribed by licensed physicians. The speed freaks in Haight-Ashbury were using a tiny fraction of the total supply. The real amphetamine epidemic was happening in doctors' offices and medicine cabinets across the country, but because it came with prescriptions and medical supervision, it was invisible. Congress finally began to take notice. Hearings were held in 1970, lawmakers questioning how it was possible that billions of amphetamine pills were being produced annually when the legitimate medical need was clearly far smaller. Testimony revealed that pharmaceutical companies were manufacturing amphetamine in quantities that vastly exceeded any conceivable therapeutic use, and that much of the excess was being diverted into black markets or prescribed frivolously for conditions that did not warrant such powerful stimulants.
Doctors testified about patients who had been taking amphetamine daily for years, who could not function without it, who exhibited all the signs of dependency but were never diagnosed as addicts because their drug use was legal and medically sanctioned. The hearings exposed what should have been obvious all along. America had an amphetamine problem, and the prescription model had enabled it rather than prevented it. But the solution that emerged from these hearings was not designed to help the people who had become dependent on amphetamine, either through prescriptions or through street use. The solution was control, criminalization, a framework that would punish users, particularly those without access to doctors and prescriptions, while leaving the pharmaceutical industry largely intact. The contradictions were unsustainable. Two versions of the same drug, two entirely different moral and legal frameworks, two sets of users treated with radically different consequences. The collision between medical amphetamine and street methamphetamine had revealed the fundamental incoherence of America's drug policy, a system that condemned some forms of drug use while enabling others based on class, race, and access to medical authority. The speed freaks in Haight-Ashbury were dying or burning out, their bodies and minds wrecked by methamphetamine. But millions of other Americans were still taking amphetamine every day, prescribed by doctors, picked up at pharmacies, swallowed in suburban kitchens and college dorm rooms, with no sense that they were participating in the same epidemic. In 1970, the government finally acted, but not to help, to control. On October 27, 1970, President Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act into law. This legislation created a scheduling system to classify drugs based on their potential for abuse and accepted medical use. Amphetamine and methamphetamine were placed in Schedule II, a designation reserved for substances considered to have high potential for abuse, but also recognized legitimate medical applications. This was not a ban. It was a reclassification, a tightening of regulatory controls intended to reduce the avalanche of pills flowing through American society. The immediate effects were dramatic. Pharmaceutical production of amphetamine plummeted from 12 billion doses in 1970 to approximately 5 billion in 1971. Prescriptions became harder to obtain. Doctors, now facing scrutiny from the newly empowered Drug Enforcement Administration, became cautious, even fearful, about prescribing stimulants. The EEA could review prescription records, question medical decisions, revoke licenses for what they deemed inappropriate prescribing. Many physicians simply stopped writing amphetamine prescriptions altogether rather than risk regulatory consequences. But the Controlled Substances Act did not eliminate demand. It only restricted supply through legal channels. And in doing so, it created exactly the outcome it was designed to prevent. The middle class, those with access to healthcare, insurance, and sympathetic physicians, continued to receive amphetamine prescriptions. Dextrane remained available for narcolepsy and certain cases of attention disorders. Later, in 1996, Adderall would be introduced and become one of the most prescribed medications in America, proving that pharmaceutical amphetamine never truly went away. It simply rebranded, refined its marketing, and targeted it.
Demographics with political and economic power. But for the working class, the poor, the marginalized, those without insurance or access to doctors willing to navigate the new regulatory maze, legal amphetamine became effectively inaccessible. Truck drivers who had relied on Benzedrine to stay awake through cross-country hauls could no longer get prescriptions. Factory workers on grueling night shifts found their doctors unwilling to prescribe stimulants. The millions of Americans who had become dependent on amphetamine, not through reckless recreation, but through years of medically sanctioned use, were suddenly cut off. They did not simply stop using. They turned to the black market. This is where crank was born. The term referred to methamphetamine produced not in pharmaceutical laboratories, but in makeshift operations run by outlaw chemists, often affiliated with motorcycle gangs. The Hells Angels and other biker gangs recognized a business opportunity. They had connections, they had territory, they had a population of desperate users who needed product and couldn't get it legally. The synthesis of methamphetamine is not exceptionally difficult for someone with basic chemistry knowledge and access to precursor chemicals. Ephedrine or pseudoephedrine, readily available in over-the-counter cold medications, could be chemically reduced to produce methamphetamine. The purity varied wildly depending on the skill of the chemist and the quality of the ingredients. Some batches were relatively clean, others were contaminated with toxic byproducts, lye, battery acid, solvents that caused immediate harm to users. Rural America became a primary market. Truck drivers, agricultural workers, laborers in dying industrial towns, people who worked long hours for low pay, who had become accustomed to amphetamine as a tool for endurance. They knew the pharmaceutical version was safer, cleaner, but it was no longer available. Crank was,
so they used crank. The purity was inconsistent, the dosage unpredictable, the side effects more severe, but it was available, and for people whose livelihoods depended on staying awake and functional through physical exhaustion, that was enough. The Controlled Substances Act had succeeded in reducing legal pharmaceutical production. It had succeeded in making doctors afraid to prescribe, but it had utterly failed to reduce amphetamine use. Instead, it pushed users from regulated pharmaceutical supply into an unregulated black market, where quality was unknown, purity was variable, and danger was constant. This was regulatory theater, the appearance of control without the substance of care. The government had not addressed why so many Americans felt they needed amphetamine to function. It had not provided addiction treatment for those who had become dependent through legal prescriptions. It had not confronted the pharmaceutical industry's role in creating mass dependency. It had simply criminalized a problem that had been legal and medically sanctioned just months earlier. And criminalization has consequences. When you make something illegal, you don't make it disappear. You make it invisible. You drive it underground where it becomes more dangerous, more profitable, and more entangled with organized crime. You create a black market that enriches criminals while punishing users, many of whom are guilty of nothing more than continuing to use a substance their own doctors once prescribed. The stage was now set for what would become, over the next 4 decades, one of the most destructive drug epidemics in American history. Not because methamphetamines suddenly became more dangerous, but because the legal framework shifted in ways that guaranteed maximum harm to the most vulnerable populations. As pharmaceutical speed became harder to get, the black market exploded. Throughout the 1970s, methamphetamine production remained largely the domain of biker gangs and outlaw chemists operating in garages, trailers, and remote rural properties across the American West. These were small-scale operations, crude but effective. The synthesis method most commonly used was ephedrine reduction, a relatively simple chemical process that required ephedrine or pseudoephedrine, both readily available in over-the-counter cold medications, along with red phosphorus, iodine, and a few other chemicals that could be purchased from hardware stores or agricultural suppliers. The resulting product was called crank, and while it lacked the pharmaceutical purity of the methadone that had circulated in Haight-Ashbury a decade earlier, it was potent enough to satisfy demand. The name crank allegedly originated from the practice of hiding methamphetamine in the crankcase of motorcycles during transport, though the etymology is disputed. What is not disputed is that by the mid-1970s, crank had become the primary form of methamphetamine available to working-class Americans who could no longer access prescriptions. Rural America was hit
hardest. Small towns in California, Oregon, Montana, the Dakotas, places where economic opportunities were shrinking, where factories were closing, where agricultural work was backbreaking and poorly paid. Methamphetamine was cheap, widely available, and initially functional. Truckers used it to drive through the night. Ranch hands used it to work 18-hour days during harvest season. It filled the gap left by the withdrawal of pharmaceutical amphetamine, and for a while, users could convince themselves it was just another tool for survival. But methamphetamine is not a sustainable tool. It is alone against the body, and the interest compounds mercilessly. In the 1980s, the methamphetamine trade underwent a transformation. Mexican drug cartels, which had built sophisticated smuggling networks and distribution systems for marijuana and cocaine, recognized that methamphetamine represented a lucrative opportunity. Unlike plant-based drugs, which required specific climates and growing seasons, methamphetamine could be synthesized anywhere with the right equipment and precursor chemicals, and Mexico had access to industrial quantities of ephedrine, imported legally from pharmaceutical suppliers in Asia and Europe. The cartels began constructing super labs, large-scale methamphetamine production facilities capable of producing 10, 20, even 50 pounds of product per cook. These were not makeshift operations in trailers. These were sophisticated chemical laboratories, often staffed by trained chemists, producing methamphetamine with purity levels approaching 90%. The economies of scale allowed cartels to flood the American market with cheap, high-quality methamphetamine while still generating enormous profits. Distribution networks extended from the Southwest, California, Arizona, New Mexico, into the Midwest and eventually nationwide. Small-town America, already economically devastated by deindustrialization and the collapse of family farming, became the primary market.
Methamphetamine use metastasized through communities that had been stable for generations, tearing apart families, driving crime rates to levels previously unimaginable in rural areas. The human cost became visible, undeniable, horrifying. Meth mouth, the rapid and catastrophic dental decay caused by methamphetamine's effects on saliva production, combined with users' tendency to grind their teeth and neglect hygiene during binges, became a marker of addiction so distinctive that dentists could identify users on sight. Skin sores appeared, the result of obsessive picking at hallucinated insects beneath the skin, wounds that refuse to heal because methamphetamine suppresses the immune system and constricts blood vessels. Weight loss became emaciation, eyes became hollow, faces gaunt, bodies reduced to skeletal frames animated by chemical compulsion. Paranoia and psychosis became endemic. Methamphetamine, particularly when used heavily over extended periods, induces a form of psychosis that is clinically indistinguishable from schizophrenia. Users become convinced they are being watched, followed, targeted. They dismantle electronics searching for hidden surveillance devices. They barricade themselves in homes, convinced that neighbors or police or shadowy conspirators are preparing to attack. The violence that emerges from this state is unpredictable and often directed at the people closest to the user: spouses, children, friends. Communities collapsed. Child protective services in states like Montana, Iowa, Oklahoma began removing children from homes at unprecedented rates, overwhelmed by cases of neglect and abuse tied to parental methamphetamine addiction. Crime surged. Theft, burglary, domestic violence, assault, all spiked in counties where methamphetamine use had taken hold. Small-town police departments, which had once dealt primarily with traffic violations and minor disturbances, found themselves confronting levels of violence and disorder they were neither trained nor equipped to handle. And throughout all of this, pharmaceutical amphetamine continued its own parallel existence, entirely legal, entirely sanctioned, thriving in a completely different America. In 1996, Shire Pharmaceuticals released Adderall, a mixed amphetamine salt formulation marketed for the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This was not a new drug. It was a rebranding of an older formulation called Obeterol, which had been used as a diet pill in the 1970s. But the ADHD market was expanding rapidly, driven by increased diagnosis rates and pharmaceutical marketing that positioned stimulants as essential tools for academic and professional success. Adderall became a blockbuster. Millions of prescriptions were written annually, mostly for children and college students. White, suburban, middle-class children were diagnosed with ADHD and given daily doses of pharmaceutical-grade amphetamine. Their parents saw this as responsible medical
treatment, evidence-based intervention for a legitimate disorder. And it often was. But the class and race dynamics were impossible to ignore. A white teenager in a suburban high school could take Adderall daily, prescribed by a psychiatrist, dispensed by a pharmacy, and face no legal consequences. A poor white or Hispanic adult in rural Montana using methamphetamine, chemically almost identical, pharmacologically nearly indistinguishable, faced arrest, prosecution, imprisonment, and the permanent mark of a felony conviction that would follow them for life. 2 amphetamine stories, 2 Americas. The divide was not based on the substance itself, but on who was using it, how they obtained it, and what their access to medical and legal systems looked like. Prescription amphetamine thrived. It was researched, refined, marketed, normalized. Methamphetamine was criminalized, demonized, used as justification for mass incarceration and militarized drug enforcement. The war on drugs had created a 2-tiered system where the same molecule received entirely different treatment depending on whether it came from a pharmacy or a superlab, whether it was consumed by children with insurance or adults without it. By the 1990s, America had 2 amphetamine stories. One was medicine, the other was war. Between 1995 and 2005, the media discovered methamphetamine. It had been destroying rural communities for over a decade, but now it became a national story, a moral panic that saturated news coverage and shaped public policy. The imagery was deliberately horrifying. Faces of meth campaigns spread across law enforcement agencies and media outlets, displaying before and after mugshot comparisons that showed the physical deterioration of methamphetamine users over months or years. Fresh-faced young people transformed into gaunt, hollow-eyed figures with rotting teeth, open sores, and expressions of blank desperation. These campaigns were presented as public health warnings, cautionary tales meant to deter potential users.
but they were also dehumanizing spectacles, reducing human beings struggling with addiction to cautionary images, objects of horror rather than subjects deserving of compassion or medical care. The message was clear. This is what happens to people who use meth. They stop being people. The framing of the meth epidemic revealed something deeply uncomfortable about American drug policy and American empathy. Methamphetamine was hitting rural white communities hardest, small towns in the Midwest, the Mountain West, Appalachia. And suddenly, for the first time in decades of drug war rhetoric, addiction was being discussed as a disease rather than a crime. Users were portrayed as victims rather than criminals. Treatment was presented as the solution rather than incarceration. The contrast with the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s was stark and undeniable. When crack devastated predominantly black urban neighborhoods, the response was criminalization, harsh mandatory minimum sentences, the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which imposed a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine, ensuring that black users received drastically longer prison sentences than white users of chemically similar drugs. There were no before and after mugshots framed as tragic health warnings. There were no national conversations about treating addiction as a disease. There was only incarceration, family separation, and the wholesale destruction of communities through mass imprisonment. But when methamphetamine began claiming white lives in white communities, the narrative shifted. These were our kids, the media insisted. These were hardworking people from good families who had made mistakes, who deserved second chances, who needed treatment and support. The racist double standard was so blatant that even some conservative lawmakers acknowledged it, though acknowledgement rarely translated into reforming the policies that had devastated black communities a generation earlier. In 2005, Congress passed the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act as part of the USA Patriot Act reauthorization. The legislation imposed restrictions on the sale of cold medications containing pseudoephedrine, the primary precursor chemical used in small-scale methamphetamine production. Pseudoephedrine products were moved behind pharmacy counters. Customers had to present identification, sign logs, and were limited in the quantity they could purchase each month. Pharmacies were required to report suspicious purchasing patterns to law enforcement. The stated goal was to cripple domestic methamphetamine production by cutting off access to precursor chemicals. In practice, the law accomplished almost nothing. Small-scale domestic meth labs did decline, but this had virtually no impact on overall methamphetamine availability. Mexican cartels, which by 2005 dominated the methamphetamine market, were not using cold medicine. They were importing industrial
Quantities of ephedrine and pseudoephedrine from pharmaceutical suppliers in Asia and Europe, synthesizing methamphetamine in super labs, and smuggling finished product across the border by the ton. The Combat Meth Epidemic Act was theater, legislative action designed to create the appearance of response without addressing the actual problem. It inconvenienced people with sinus infections. It did nothing to reduce methamphetamine use, methamphetamine addiction, or the social devastation methamphetamine was causing in communities across America. Meanwhile, methamphetamine was being culturally codified in ways that would shape public perception for years. Breaking Bad, which aired from 2008 to 2013, became one of the most critically acclaimed and culturally influential television series in history. It told the story of Walter White, a high school chemistry teacher who becomes a methamphetamine kingpin, building a drug empire characterized by violence, manipulation, and moral collapse. The show was brilliant television. It was also a fantasy. The vast majority of people involved in methamphetamine, whether as producers, distributors, or users, are not criminal masterminds or violent sociopaths. They are struggling addicts, small-time dealers trying to fund their own habits, desperate people trapped in cycles of dependency and poverty. The typical methamphetamine user is not a danger to society. They are a danger primarily to themselves, and they need medical care, not incarceration. But Breaking Bad crystallized a mythology, methamphetamine as the domain of evil genius, of moral corruption so profound it transforms ordinary people into monsters. This mythology served a political function. It justified continued criminalization, continued mass incarceration, continued refusal to treat addiction as a public health crisis requiring medical intervention. The reality was far more mundane and far more tragic. People were using methamphetamine because they were exhausted, because they were poor, because they had been prescribed amphetamine legally for years and then cut off, because they lived in communities with no economic opportunities and no hope, and methamphetamine made them feel for a few hours like they could cope. They were not villains. They were casualties of policy failures, economic abandonment, and a healthcare system that had medicalized amphetamine for the wealthy while criminalizing it for the poor.
The meth panic revealed who receives empathy in America and who receives punishment. It revealed that drug policy is inseparable from race and class, and it revealed that even when the devastation was happening to white communities, the response was still more about control than care, more about optics than outcomes. While meth dominated headlines, prescription amphetamine quietly exploded. In 1996, the same year Congress was laying groundwork for what would become the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act, Shire Pharmaceuticals released Adderall. This was mixed amphetamine salts, dextroamphetamine and levoamphetamine in precise ratios, marketed specifically for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The medication itself was not new. It was essentially a rebranded version of Obeterol, a diet pill from the 1970s, but the marketing strategy was revolutionary. Shire and other pharmaceutical companies recognized that ADHD, if properly promoted, represented an enormous untapped market. They funded patient advocacy groups, sponsored medical conferences, distributed educational materials to schools and pediatricians, and ran television advertisements that normalized the idea of medicating children for behavior that previous generations might have simply called energetic or difficult. The message was consistent. ADHD is a legitimate neurological disorder. It is underdiagnosed, and stimulant medication is safe, effective, and necessary for affected children to succeed. The strategy worked beyond anyone's projections. ADHD diagnosis rates exploded. In the 1990s, approximately 3% of American children were diagnosed with ADHD. By the 2010s, that number had reached 10%, with some regions reporting rates as high as 15%. Millions of children, overwhelmingly boys, were prescribed daily amphetamine. Adderall became the third most prescribed medication for teenagers in America, behind only antibiotics and asthma medication. But the medication did not stay contained to diagnosed children. College campuses became secondary markets where Adderall circulated freely, bought and sold like any other commodity. Studies conducted in the 2000s and 2010s found that between 15 and 40% of college students reported using stimulants non-medically at least once. During finals weeks, the numbers climbed higher. Students who had prescriptions sold their pills to classmates. Students without prescriptions learned to game psychiatric evaluations, answering screening questions in ways that
Guaranteed diagnosis and access to medication. The culture around this use was strikingly casual. Taking Adderall to study was not seen as cheating or drug abuse. It was framed as productivity optimization, as doing whatever it takes to compete in an increasingly demanding academic environment. The term study drug sanitized what was actually happening: widespread non-prescribed amphetamine use for cognitive enhancement. Students convinced themselves this was fundamentally different from the methamphetamine use happening in rural communities, even though the pharmacological differences were marginal. Silicon Valley embraced amphetamine with even less ambiguity. In the tech industry's relentless culture of optimization and competition, Adderall and Vyvanse, a prodrug of dextroamphetamine released in 2007, became tools for productivity, focus, and endurance. Engineers, programmers, and entrepreneurs use stimulants to work 18-hour days to maintain edge in industries where falling behind meant obsolescence. This was not addiction, they insisted. This was biohacking, life optimization, rational use of pharmacological tools to enhance performance. The language was different, but the dependency was identical. The class divide could not have been more stark. A white college student with a prescription for Adderall, obtained through a psychiatrist, filled at a pharmacy, covered by insurance, was engaging in legitimate medical treatment, or at worst, harmless academic enhancement. A poor white or Hispanic adult in rural America using methamphetamine, chemically nearly identical, pharmacologically producing almost the same effects, was a criminal, subject to arrest, prosecution, imprisonment, and permanent social stigma. Same molecule, different packaging, different justice. The pharmaceutical industry profited enormously. By the 2010s, ADHD stimulant medications generated approximately $13 billion in annual revenue. Shire, which was eventually acquired by Takeda Pharmaceutical for $62 billion in 2019, built much of its value on Adderall and Vyvanse. The medications were classified as Schedule II controlled substances, theoretically subject to the same regulatory scrutiny as methamphetamine. But in practice, the prescription pathway made them widely accessible to those with healthcare, insurance, and the ability to navigate medical systems. Then, in 2022, the facade cracked.
A combination of manufacturing disruptions, DEA production quotas, and surging demand created severe Adderall shortages that persisted through 2023 and beyond. Millions of Americans who had been taking amphetamine daily, sometimes for years or decades, suddenly could not obtain their medication. Pharmacies had empty shelves, doctors could not find alternatives, patients panicked. The language they used was revealing. I can't function without it. I can't work. I can't focus. I can't be myself. These were not the words of people taking medication for a discrete medical condition. These were the words of dependency, of brains that had adopted to the constant presence of amphetamine and could no longer operate normally in its absence. This was addiction, even if no one wanted to call it that. The shortages exposed the scope of America's pharmaceutical amphetamine use. This was not a few 100,000 children with severe ADHD. This was tens of millions of people, children, teenagers, college students, professionals, parents, who had been prescribed amphetamine and had come to depend on it for daily functioning. The medical system had created exactly what the Controlled Substances Act was supposedly designed to prevent: mass amphetamine dependency, sanctioned and facilitated by doctors and pharmaceutical companies. But unlike methamphetamine users who faced criminalization and social condemnation, Adderall users faced sympathy. The shortages were covered as a public health crisis, a medication access problem, a failure of pharmaceutical supply chains. There were no faces of Adderall campaigns showing the before and after deterioration of long-term stimulant users. There were no calls for criminalization or increased enforcement. There was only acknowledgement that millions of people needed this medication and could not get it, and that this was a problem requiring solutions. The hypocrisy was complete. Society had accepted pharmaceutical amphetamine as medicine, as enhancement, as a tool for success. It had simultaneously demonized street methamphetamine as poison, as moral failure, as justification for imprisonment. The substances were chemically cousins, separated by minor molecular differences that produced marginal pharmacological distinctions, but the social, legal, and moral gulf between them was vast, determined entirely by who was using them, how they were obtained, and what cultural narratives surrounded them. A century after benzodrine first appeared in American pharmacies, amphetamine had bifurcated
into two parallel realities that existed in the same country, governed by the same laws, but experienced by populations that might as well have been living on different planets. So here we are, a century after benzodrine. Two stories, two Americas, same drug. But beneath the policy debates and the cultural contradictions, beneath the statistics and the legislation, there are human beings, people whose lives have been consumed, distorted, or destroyed by amphetamine in its various forms. Their stories are not abstractions. They are not data points. They are tragedies that repeat, with slight variations, in small towns and cities across America every single day. Consider a composite portrait, drawn from thousands of similar cases. A woman in her 30s living in rural Montana. She started using methamphetamine 5 years ago, not for recreation but for function. She was working 2 jobs, trying to support 3 children as a single mother after her husband left. Exhaustion was not just uncomfortable, it was unsustainable. Methamphetamine gave her energy, focus, the ability to work a morning shift at a diner and an evening shift cleaning office buildings while still caring for her children. For a while, it worked. Then it stopped working. The doses increased. The periods between uses shortened. Her weight dropped. Her teeth began to rot. The pain constant but ignored because dental care was unaffordable, and methamphetamine made everything else seem distant. Her children noticed the changes, the irritability, the paranoia, the days when she would not sleep, pacing the house, checking windows, convinced someone was watching. Child Protective Services received a call. An investigation followed. Her children were removed and placed in foster care. She was arrested, charged with possession and child endangerment, and given a choice: prison or court-mandated treatment that she could not afford and that had a waiting list of 6 months. Now consider another story. A college student at a prestigious East Coast university. He was diagnosed with ADHD during his sophomore year after struggling with focus and motivation. His psychiatrist prescribed Adderall, 30 milligrams daily. It transformed his academic performance. He went from barely passing to Dean's List. He felt sharper, more capable, more like the person he believed he should be. After graduation, he continued taking it. Then he increased the dose, convincing his doctor he needed more. Now, years later, he cannot imagine functioning without it.
On days when he forgets to take his medication or cannot get his prescription refilled, he experiences crushing depression, profound fatigue, an inability to concentrate that makes even simple tasks feel impossible. He is dependent. He knows he is dependent. But the dependency is legal, sanctioned, covered by insurance. He suffers in socially acceptable silence. Consider a third story, a veteran who returned from Afghanistan in 2011. He had taken amphetamine during deployments, issued by military physicians to stay alert during long missions. Back home, he could not sleep, could not silence the hypervigilance that had kept him alive in combat but now made civilian life unbearable. He sought help from the VA, received prescriptions for sleeping pills and antidepressants that did not work. Eventually, he found methamphetamine, not from a dealer but from another veteran who understood. It quieted the noise, dulled the memories, made the world feel manageable again. He knows it is destroying him. He does not know how to stop. These are not exceptional stories. They are typical, repeated in endless variations across different demographics, different regions, different entry points into amphetamine use. The physical toll is well documented. Cardiovascular disease. Amphetamine constricts blood vessels, raises blood pressure, accelerates heart rate, increasing risk of heart attack and stroke even in young users. Neurotoxicity. Chronic use damages dopamine-producing neurons, potentially causing permanent cognitive deficits and increasing risk of Parkinson's disease later in life. Dental decay, not just from methamphetamine, but from any long-term stimulant use that reduces saliva production and promotes teeth grinding. The psychological toll is equally severe. Paranoia and psychosis during active use, depression and anhedonia during withdrawal. Amphetamine floods the brain with dopamine, and over time, the brain adapts by reducing its natural dopamine production and sensitivity. When the drug is removed, what remains is a neurochemical deficit that manifests as profound depression, inability to experience pleasure, exhaustion so severe that getting out of bed feels impossible. This withdrawal state can last for months, sometimes longer, and during that time, the risk of relapse is overwhelming because using again provides immediate, if temporary, relief. The social destruction extends beyond individual users. Families are torn
apart. Children enter foster care systems already overwhelmed and underfunded. Incarceration removes parents, partners, breadwinners, leaving those who remain to cope with both grief and economic catastrophe. Communities, particularly rural communities already struggling with economic decline, collapse under the weight of addiction, crime, and the exodus of anyone with the means to leave. Treatment options are limited and inadequate. Unlike opioid addiction, for which medication-assisted treatment with methadone or buprenorphine has proven effective, there is no equivalent for amphetamine dependency. Withdrawal must be endured, not medicated. Recovery requires months of psychiatric support, behavioral therapy, and often treatment for co-occurring mental health conditions, resources that are scarce, expensive, and inaccessible to most of those who need them. Overdose deaths from amphetamine are less common than from opioids, but the long-term damage is devastating. Hearts fail, strokes occur in people in their 20s and 30s, cognitive impairment becomes permanent, and the justice system continues to criminalize the poorest users, while the more affluent obtain prescriptions and carry on. Millions are still using, millions are still suffering, and the structures that created this crisis remain firmly in place. The drug war promised to save us from amphetamine. It only made everything worse. Let us assess with clear eyes what 5 decades of prohibition have accomplished. The outcomes are not speculative. They are documented, quantifiable, and catastrophic. Mass incarceration. Since the 1970 Controlled Substances Act placed methamphetamine under federal control, over 500,000 Americans have been imprisoned for methamphetamine-related offenses. 500,000 human beings removed from their families, their communities, their lives, and placed in cages. The average sentence for methamphetamine possession with intent to distribute is over 5 years in federal prison, often longer in state systems. These are not cartel leaders or violent kingpins. The vast majority are low-level users and small-time dealers, people who are themselves addicted, selling to fund their own habits. Cartel enrichment. Prohibition did not eliminate the methamphetamine market. It criminalized it, which had the predictable effect of handing a multi-billion-dollar industry to organized crime. Mexican cartels, which now control approximately 90% of the methamphetamine entering the United States, generate an estimated $3 billion annually from meth sales alone. Prohibition is not a barrier to their business, it is the foundation of their business. Without prohibition, there would be no black market premium, no enforcement risk premium, no reason for criminal organizations to be involved at all. Contaminated supply. When drugs are illegal, there is no quality control, no regulation, no accountability.
Methamphetamine purchased on the black market may contain what it is supposed to contain, or it may be cut with fentanyl, with levamisole, with battery acid, with any number of adulterants that increase profit margins while poisoning users. In recent years, methamphetamine contaminated with fentanyl has caused a surge in overdose deaths among people who were not seeking opioids and had no tolerance to them. This is a direct consequence of prohibition. Pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamine, which still exists and is legally prescribed under the brand name Disoxin, does not have this problem because it is manufactured under regulatory oversight. Street methamphetamine kills not because the substance itself is uniquely lethal, but because prohibition ensures its production and distribution occur outside any system of safety or accountability. Public health catastrophe. Methamphetamine is commonly injected, which creates risk of HIV and hepatitis C transmission through shared needles. Harm reduction strategies like needle exchange programs, which provide clean syringes and reduce disease transmission, have been proven effective in every country that implements them. But in much of the United States, needle exchanges remain illegal or severely restricted, blocked by politicians who argue that providing clean needles enables drug use. The result is predictable. HIV and hepatitis C rates among methamphetamine users remain unnecessarily high, chronic diseases spread that could have been prevented, and the public health costs compound over decades. So what did prohibition fail to accomplish? The stated goals: reduced use, reduced harm, reduced availability. Methamphetamine is more available now than it was in 1970. It is cheaper, purer, and more widely distributed. The 2021 National Survey on Drug Use and Health estimated that approximately 2.5 million Americans use methamphetamine in the past year, a number that has remained relatively stable or increased slightly over the past 2 decades despite
Escalating enforcement. Prohibition has not reduced demand. It has only ensured that the supply is controlled by criminals and that users face maximum harm with minimum support. Other countries have demonstrated that alternatives exist. In 2001, Portugal decriminalized possession of all drugs, including methamphetamine, and redirected resources from enforcement to treatment. Drug use did not explode. It declined in some demographics and stabilized in others. Overdose deaths dropped. HIV transmission rates among drug users fell dramatically. People who needed treatment could seek it without fear of arrest. Switzerland, facing a heroin crisis in the 1980s, implemented a program providing pharmaceutical-grade heroin to dependent users in supervised medical settings. The program reduced overdose deaths, reduced crime, reduced disease transmission, and allowed many users to stabilize their lives and eventually reduce or cease their drug use. A similar model could work for methamphetamine, providing pharmaceutical-grade amphetamine to dependent users under medical supervision, eliminating the risks of contaminated supply while connecting users to healthcare and social services. These models are not theoretical. They exist. They work. They are evidence-based, cost-effective, and humane. But in the United States, they are politically impossible. Any politician who proposes decriminalization or harm reduction is attacked as soft on drugs, as enabling addiction, as betraying communities devastated by drug use. The fact that punitive approaches have failed for 50 years, that they have caused immeasurable suffering without achieving their stated goals, is rarely mentioned in these attacks. The choice America faces is not between a perfect solution and the status quo. It is between a public health approach that treats addiction as a medical condition requiring care and a punitive approach that treats it as a moral failure requiring punishment. We have tried punishment for 5 decades. The results are unambiguous. Hundreds of thousands incarcerated, billions spent, communities destroyed, and methamphetamine more available than ever. The drug war did not fail because it wasn't harsh enough. It failed because prohibition as a strategy for managing drug use does not work and has never worked. Which brings us back to the beginning, to the molecule itself. What is amphetamine, really? Strip away the propaganda. Strip away the pharmaceutical marketing and the moral panic, the speed kills posters and the pristine Adderall advertisements. Remove the century of contradictory narratives, the war rhetoric and the medical legitimacy. What remains is a molecule, phenylisopropylamine, a compound that does not carry meaning or intention. It simply interacts with human neurology in predictable ways. Amphetamine is not harmless. Let us be absolutely clear about this. It is neurotoxic at high doses or with chronic use, causing damage to dopamine-producing neurons that may be permanent. It places enormous strain on the cardiovascular system, increasing risk of heart attack, stroke, and long-term cardiac damage. It is psychologically addictive, not because it creates physical withdrawal symptoms comparable to opioids or alcohol, but because it makes users feel capable, focused, powerful, and the absence of those feelings once experienced can be unbearable. Dependence is real. Harm is real. But amphetamine is also not demonic. Millions of people take prescribed stimulants, Adderall, Vyvanse, Dexedrine, daily for years or decades and do not spiral into addiction or destruction.
For many, particularly those with genuine attention disorders or narcolepsy, these medications are life-changing in positive ways. They allow people to function, to work, to maintain relationships, to build lives that would otherwise be impossible. The molecule itself is indifferent. It does what it does. The outcomes depend on dose, frequency, context, and the support system surrounding the user. The problem was never the molecule. It was never really about pharmacology. The problem was always about control, about who decides what uses are legitimate and what uses are criminal, about who profits from production and distribution, about who gets treated with compassion and who gets punished with cages. For a century, we have told two contradictory stories about the same substance. We have said that amphetamine prescribed by a psychiatrist and purchased at a pharmacy is medicine, enhancement, a tool for success. And we have said that methamphetamine purchased on the street is poison, moral failure, justification for imprisonment. These stories exist simultaneously, enforced by legal systems that treat chemically similar substances with radically different consequences based on packaging, branding, and the socioeconomic status of the user. We have oscillated between extremes. In the 1950s, we commercialized amphetamine to an absurd degree, producing billions
of pills annually and prescribing them for everything from fatigue to sadness. When the costs of that approach became undeniable, we swung to prohibition and criminalization, driving users into black markets and creating the conditions for cartel control and contaminated supply. Now, in the 2020s, pharmaceutical amphetamine is again ascendant, prescribed widely for ADHD and used non-medically by millions for productivity and enhancement, while methamphetamine users are still arrested, still imprisoned, still treated as criminals for using a nearly identical substance. We have not found balance. We have not learned. We do not know, as a society, how to manage powerful psychoactive substances in ways that minimize harm while respecting human autonomy and addressing the underlying conditions, exhaustion, economic precarity, mental illness, trauma, that drive people to seek chemical solutions in the first place. The questions remain open. Can we learn from this history? Can we build systems that treat drug use as a public health issue rather than a criminal justice problem? Can we provide care instead of cages, treatment instead of punishment, pharmaceutical-grade substances under medical supervision instead of forcing dependent users into black markets? Can we acknowledge the class and race contradictions that have defined drug policy for a century and commit to something more just? Or will we repeat these patterns with the next substance and the next, oscillating forever between commercial exploitation and punitive prohibition, never finding a middle path that prioritizes human welfare over profit and control? These are not rhetorical questions. They demand answers. They demand choices. There are still people in prison, right now, serving sentences for possessing methamphetamine while others take Adderall legally every morning. There are still communities devastated by enforcement strategies that have failed for 50 years. There are still millions of people dependent on amphetamine in one form or another, and we still have not built systems adequate to support them. The molecule remains, unchanged, indifferent. It will continue to exist, will continue to be synthesized, will continue to interact with human brains in the same ways it has for a century. But we carry the weight. We carry the history. We carry the responsibility for what we choose to do next. The ending is not yet written.